Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gott, du selber, bist, das Licht, which translates to, O God, who art the only light. Fairly straightforward chorale today. This is actually a good example of a chorale that if you wanted a straightforward one to analyze, not too many twists and turns, fairly clear modulation points and conventional chord progressions, this is a good one to pick. It has a good amount of density in terms of subdivision versus straightforward harmonic rhythm, and all the chord progressions are mostly normative, I would say. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So 2 flats in the key signature. We start with G minor, we end with G major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor. And notice here how we have 2 flats in the key signature rather than 1 flat in the key signature, which is sometimes used by Bach to convey G minor as well. We start off with our tonic triad, passing tones in the lower voices before we get B flat, D, G, and G, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We could just change the figured bass there. We get A, C, F sharp, and A, which is F sharp diminished over A, that's 7/6, and this typically resolves to a tonic triad in root position, which in this case it does. G, D, G, and B flat. This is a really common pattern in Bach where he takes a chord, then uses a chord that has a diatonic step below it, and in first inversion to pass to the same chord that is in either in first inversion or root position, depending on the first chord. So in this case, and probably the most common instance of this pattern, you'll see 1, 7, and 1, whether it's 1/6 at the beginning or 1/6 at the end. That's based on the direction that the bass is moving, but this is the most common pattern that we'll see involving these 2 chords. We'll also see, sometimes like 4 and 3, sometimes we'll see 3 and 2, 6 and 5. We've encountered a couple of them, more than a couple. And then we get F sharp, E, A, and C. You could make an argument this is an F sharp fully diminished 7th chord, because that's actually E flat, not E natural. But I think this E flat is actually an accented non-chord tone, and this is 5/6/5 D7 over F sharp. But the chords are functionally the same and largely consisting of the same pitches, so it doesn't really matter how you analyze it. But then we get G, D, A, and B flat, which this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, making this a tonic triad, G minor. And then we get C, E flat, G, and A. That is A minor 7 flat 5 over C. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential situations. This F sharp is a non-chord tone. This E natural is kind of interesting, happening in such close proximity to E flat, but it's also a non-chord tone, sort of to satisfy this melodic minor fragment here. And then we get D major, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our dominant 2/6/5 going to 5, fairly straightforward, and one of our most common cadential progressions. We then get A going to D. D is a chord tone, C is a non-chord tone, and then our perfect authentic cadence ends with G minor, tonic triad, G, B flat, D, and G. Moving ahead, we have a phrase that ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, and I'm fairly convinced that we spend the entire time in the key of F major, and this G minor serves as our sort of conduit into the key. G minor is now our 2 chord in the key of F, and then we go to C major, E, C, G, and C, with a passing 7th here in the tenor. That would be 5/6, and then we go to 1, F, A, F, and C. Our tonic triad, F major. G is a passing tone, B flat is a passing tone, and E is a neighbor tone, but when we take the aggregate of all the tones here, we get C7 over G, which is 5/4/3, and then we go to A, C, F, and C, which is F major over A. first inversion. Very similar to 1-6-7-6-1. 5-4-3 is basically a 7-6 chord, except for we have a C in the chord rather than a G or a B flat, or even a double leading tone in some cases. F and A here, it very briefly takes the chord and puts it back in root position as well. That's not super important that you analyze that. It's just something that I'm keeping track of because I think it's interesting when we have an entirely intact chord when Bach moves voices off of the harmonic rhythm as well. We then get B flat, F, and D, which is our 4 chord, B flat major. B flat is a chord tone here. And then we get B flat, C, F, and C. This B flat is a lower suspension, probably like a 9-10 suspension under the melody perhaps, or a 2-3 suspension under the tenor. But this A right here would be our tonic triad in first inversion, F major over A. And we're closing in on our cadence here. And I said that we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F major here. Apologies. We have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. And I feel like any of these points could have been an accurate point to say that we've modulated a D minor, but it doesn't quite sound like it until it gets to this measure. That is how I hear it, but you could have heard it earlier or later. I think actually this G minor chord here, G, B flat, and D, which is our 2 chord in the key of F, kind of feels like we're being set up. It's somewhat deceptive in a way because we would expect a module or a cadence in the key of F major, but he even sets up the cadence with the 2 chord, right? And we would expect 5 and then 1, but after 2 we get a secondary dominant chord which tonicizes D minor, and then we cadence on D minor. So it has a bit of a deceptive vibe to it, but it's not a textbook deceptive cadence in the way that we understand it. That is, we are setting up for a cadence in the tonic key and then we get another chord, typically like a 6 chord. But we do go to the key of D minor the way that I see it, and 2 becomes 4. F is a passing tone, A is a passing tone, D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And that leaves us actually with D minor in first inversion, which is 1-6 now that we're in the key of D minor. And then we get E, G, D, and E, but I reckon this D is a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and really it's this C sharp that gives us 7-6, C sharp diminished over E. And if you remember this pattern from before, you know what we're going to get. Probably a root position tonic triad, which is exactly what we get, D, A, D, and F. Tons of space here between the inner voices, which is actually something that a viewer commented on in one of my videos recently. They were asking for, they asked a question about a research paper they were doing, and it was about why there's so much space in between the voices in a particular chorale, one of my earlier videos. And it was like one of my, in like my first, I think, 20 videos. And it's, you know, why this is taught as a voice leading practice is, I honestly don't know. I think it's more of an observation rather than a like a true codified fact. I think Bach does this all the time, even though the majority of the chorale is sort of spaced such that there isn't more than an octave in between any 2 adjacent upper 3 voices. But there's nothing explicitly stating that Bach can't do that, or really any composer can't do that. So it's kind of interesting that it's taught just like a bunch of these rules. Don't feel pressured to follow rules. These are just observations about the music of the time period, not something that makes or breaks your success as a musician because of your ability to follow or not follow them. But yeah, that's what theory is about. Regardless, sorry about going on a rant there. It just crossed my mind because that's it is, you know, somewhat interesting when that happens, because it is less common than having closer intervals between the voices, that's for sure. But we are going to go pretty much right back to the key of G minor because our A section does end in the key of G minor. Kind of interesting that our A section is longer than our B section too. Thought that was kind of a visually odd looking thing. Typically the A section has 2, maybe 3 phrases max, and then the B section is proportionate, typically longer. but here we have a repeat of an A section and then a very short B section, so kind of interesting in that regard. But that being said, we start off with G minor, which is our 4, and coincidentally also our gateway back to the key of G minor. G, G, B flat, and D. It's now our tonic triad. We then have A, G, A, and C. This G is probably like a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and we get F sharp, A, and C instead, which is 7/6, and we've seen this pattern before in this chorale twice. 1, 7, 6. We would expect 1, 6 on the other side. B flat, G, D, and B flat. Tonic triad, first inversion. We have some passing tones in the bass and the alto as well, and this does give us a chord that I think is subdividing the chord progression. C, E, G, and B flat is C7. That is a byproduct of the melodic minor scale. We could see that in the alto here. It's a 4/7 chord. It's uppercase because the quality of the chord is major. And then we get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is D major. That's our 5 chord. And we have a passing 7th here in the tenor as well, before we get E flat, B flat, G, and G, which is our 6 chord, E flat major in root position. And we also have a passing 7th in the bass. We have a bit of a deceptive progression here. We expect 5 to resolve to 1, but here it is resolving to 6. And now we're closing in on our cadence. Fairly straightforward, very evocative of it reminds us of what's happening in the first phrase here as well. I think the tenor actually does the exact same thing. And the alto, for all intents and purposes, does the same thing as well, just lacks the ornament. And the bass pretty much does the same thing too, it just lacks the ornament. And the melody basically does the same thing, except for it holds the A for 2 beats instead of repeating it twice. So the cadences are, formally speaking, like identical to one another. Okay, so that would be a 2-6-5 chord, C, E flat, G, and A. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have D, A, F sharp, and A again, which is our 5 chord, D major. D is a chord tone, C is the little passing 7th, and then we cadence on G minor. G, B flat, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, next phrase, moving into our B section, or maybe our coda. Formally speaking, I guess this is a smaller B section, but I don't really know. I'd have to look at the form a little bit more closely. But we do end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat major, and I'm going to call this G minor chord our gateway into the key of, I wrote G minor because I was saying G minor out loud. What I meant to say was B flat, because unlike our F major phrase where we get a mid-phrase modulation, right? I've been talking about the concept of mid-phrase modulation recently, where we start in a key or we visit a key that we don't end in. And sometimes Bach can do this twice or even 3 times during a phrase, but it's fairly common for him to modulate once and then modulate again for the cadence. The most common thing is that he'll spend pretty much the whole phrase in a key. But if he starts in a key and then modulates to a different key for the end, that's what I consider a mid-phrase modulation. So if he was in G minor through here, and then he stayed in G minor and then went to D minor, that would not be a mid-phrase modulation. But here, because we go from G minor, and then we go to F, and then we go to D minor, that seems like a mid-phrase modulation to me. Here, this is not a mid-phrase modulation because we stay in B flat the whole time. But then we have F, which is our 5 chord, F, C, F, and A, and with a passing 7th in the bass. Then we have D, D, F, and B flat. Yeah, B flat, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. B flat's a chord tone. C, E flat, B flat, and C, which we could be tempted to call this 2-7, like a C minor 7 chord, but I think actually what's happening here is that this B flat's a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this A is actually spelling out A diminished over C, which is 7/6. We've seen this pattern a lot in this particular chorale, and we're going from 1/6 to 7/6 back to 1, B flat, F, B flat, and D. just in root position. We've seen this pattern before. It's very common in Bach in general, not just this chorale, but we've seen it probably close to 100 times, maybe more than that actually. It seems like a very common progression that Bach draws upon to harmonize bass lines that connect the third and the one of the scale, like 1 to 3, 3 to 1. Seems fairly straightforward, even though he doesn't always do that, but sometimes he does. B flat's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but it does turn into a lower suspension here where we get A, F, C, and E flat, which is F7 over A, which is 5, 6, 5. Sorry, I read that a little quickly. It kind of tricked my brain. And then we get B flat, F, C, and D. The C, I think, is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but Bach often switches the bass up on us, so I'm going to call this a 1/6 chord. B flat major over D. So the bass resolves, but the bass switches by the time we get the resolution to our suspension that's happening at the same time. Typically, a 5/6 chord will resolve to 1 because the leading tone has a tendency to want to resolve up in the bass. And here, that is what's happening. It's just the bass gets changed on the and of the beat. So nothing really to write home about here. It's just we're experiencing Bach change the bass after a suspension. So then we get E flat, G, B flat, and C. C minor 7 over E flat, which is 2, 6, 5. And as we're getting ready for a cadence, we know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords in cadential situations. We're expecting a 5 chord. We have F. We have F again. We have A. And we have C with this little E flat here, which is actually part of a chord. It's actually part of the chord on the previous beat, so I'm not going to mark it. But this is a 5 chord that's happening in passing F major before we cadence on B flat, D, F, and B flat, or tonic triad. And our last phrase is going to end in the key of G minor, but we do stay in B flat, interestingly, like not all the way up until the cadence, but past the halfway point in the measure, maybe to the halfway point. But we start off with B flat again, B flat, D, F, and D, and then we get A, C, F, and F, which is F major over A. That's 5, 6. And this next progression here is probably the most interesting progression in the whole chorale. We have F, we have D, and we have A, which is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But instead of 5 going to 1 here, we have 5 going to 3, 6, D minor over F. Third space progressions are kind of interesting. 3 I feel like is functioning like a substitution for 1 in this case, but it's kind of interesting to see the chord resolve down. It's almost as if we would expect 5 to go to root position here, and the only thing that's holding us back is the fact that D gets introduced in the tenor, which changes our 5, 6 chord to a 3, 6 chord based on the fact that the bass changes, but it actually turns into ascending harmony that I'll turn back around and reintroduce 1 again. So we get G, B flat, G, and E flat, which is E flat major over G. That's 4, 6. And then we get some passing tones again. We have F, and we have C, and we have F. That's an anticipation, not a passing tone, but regardless, it is a 5 chord in first inversion, or sorry, 5, 6, 5 even, because we have E flat here in the melody. That would make this an F7 chord, not an F major chord. And then we basically finish this cadential progression with 1 B flat major, B flat, D, F, and D, which is our tonic triad. And I do think that this is where we modulate to the key of G minor. B flat becomes our 3 chord. It just feels like a natural progression of things. You could, it's actually kind of a small modulation zone here. It's happening somewhere over the course of these 2 beats. I don't think there is a sure way to know where it happens, but it is a relatively small zone as far as modulation zones are concerned. Sometimes they can be like a measure in length or even longer than that. So here, I think it's fairly straightforward, and a clear indicator that it's happening soon is the fact that F sharp is starting to enter the mix. But afterwards we get C, A, E, and sorry, whoa, what am I reading? C, E flat, and G, which is C minor in root position. That's our 4 chord. And then we see probably the most common subdivided progression in all of Bach's chorales, which is taking the end of the beat after 4 and turning it into a 7 chord. F sharp, A, C, and E flat. In this case, it is a 7-4-3 chord. F sharp fully diminished 7th over C. But the bass doesn't really matter too much. It's just 4 going to 7. Very common subdivided chord progression in Bach, where he links 4 going to 1 with a dominant chord in the mix as well that bridges the gap between 4 and 1. And then we get B flat, G, D, and B flat. In this case, we're resolving to G minor in first inversion. That briefly turns to root position on the end of the beat. We have 3 voices that look like they're moving off of the harmonic rhythm, but they're all chord tones, G, D, and G again. We then get D, D, G, and A. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and what we really have is this F sharp, making this a 5 chord, D major, a little brief passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on G major. Did I say G major here? I meant G minor. I said D major here. That's right. And then we go to G major, which is our tonic triad in root position. As a major chord, Bach typically ends his major chorales, or his minor chorales with a major tonic triad. I think it just has to do with the fact that major chords tended to establish a stronger sense of finality. But we've seen a couple of minor chorales recently not even end with authentic cadences, but minor chorales that do end with authentic cadences end with a minor triad, so I don't think it's really commenting too much, but it is less common. Even if it only happens 20% of the time, it is less common, despite occurring more than just a handful of times. But that's pretty much all I have to say about today's chorale. Really, the only thing to write home about is the fact that we do have this mid-phrase modulation. We modulate to F, and the phrase does not finish in F. It finishes in D minor, and then we pretty much go right back to G. Actually, no, I take that back. The fact that the A section, the first repeat, is longer than the following section is pretty interesting as well. I think that is something to take note of as well. Sometimes just visual things that strike you in sort of a fascinating way are just interesting things to take note of. And for me, having analyzed so many chorales up until this point, I think this is episode 313. That's pretty wild that I've been at this for as long as I have. I'm really excited because the journey, I'm kind of sad because the journey's coming to an end in the next couple of months, but it's also really exciting because I have a ton of data that I can go through and make much more topically focused videos, which I'm really excited for in the future. Focus on some longer, more commentary-based videos, which I'm really excited about. Not to divulge too many secrets, because I'm going to have a video about that at the end of the journey, but a little sneak peek into the future of the channel. Speaking of which, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. It helps me out a ton. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.